When Love Means Saying No, a grandmother's story. I was just finishing my tea when my grandson asked if I'd co-sign a loan. It wasn't a small one. I looked him in the eye and said, "Honey, I love you, but I can't risk my home for this." The room went quiet. My daughter, his mother, put down her fork, stood up from the dinner table and said, "Then pack your things." I thought she was joking, but she wasn't. That night I slept on the couch. Not because I wanted to, but because my room was locked. The next morning she handed me a suitcase. My own daughter. Over a loan I couldn't afford. That's when I realized, sometimes saying no is the most painful kind of love. My name is Margaret Thompson, and I'm 73 years old. I've lived through more heartbreak than most people should have to endure. But nothing prepared me for the day my own daughter chose money over family. Nothing prepared me for the cold reality that the child I raised, the little girl I held through nightmares and celebrated through triumphs, would put me out on the street because I couldn't risk my home for her son's dreams. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. Because this story didn't begin with that dinner table confrontation. It began years ago, when I first noticed the cracks in my daughter Rebecca's marriage, when I saw the desperation creeping into her eyes, and when I realized that sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us deepest. Chapter 1. The Foundation Cracks. The autumn leaves were falling like golden tears outside my kitchen window as I prepared Sunday dinner. It was October 15th, 2023, and the maple tree in my backyard was putting on its annual show, painting the world in shades of amber and crimson. I'd been living in this house for 47 years, since my late husband Robert and I bought it as newlyweds. Every corner held memories, every creaking floorboard told a story, and every room whispered of the life we'd built together. Rebecca arrived first, as she always did, her face drawn with the kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to hold too many pieces together. She was 45 then, with graying brown hair she tried to hide with expensive salon treatments she couldn't afford, and worry lines that seemed to deepen each week. Her husband David followed behind her, his shoulders hunched in that way that spoke of a man carrying burdens he couldn't share. "Mom, you didn't have to go to all this trouble," Rebecca said, kissing my cheek as she surveyed the dining room table I'd set with my good china. The same china we'd used for every special occasion, the same plates that had witnessed birthday celebrations, holiday gatherings, and quiet family dinners for decades. "It's no trouble, sweetheart," I replied, adjusting the centerpiece of fall flowers I'd arranged that morning. "Family dinner is never trouble." But I could see the trouble in her eyes, the way she glanced nervously at David, the way her hands trembled slightly as she helped me carry dishes from the kitchen. Rebecca had always been my anxious child, the one who worried about everything and everyone, the one who tried to fix problems that weren't hers to fix. My grandson Tommy arrived 20 minutes later, bursting through the front door with the kind of energy that only a 22-year-old possesses. He was tall like his father, with Rebecca's dark eyes and my stubborn chin. He'd graduated from State University that past spring with a degree in business administration, and for months he'd been talking about his plans to open a food truck business with his college friend Marcus. "Grandma Maggie," he called out, using the nickname he'd given me when he was 3, and couldn't pronounce Margaret properly. "Something smells incredible in here." I hugged him tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with the crisp October air. Tommy had always been special to me, not just because he was my only grandchild, but because he reminded me so much of Robert. He had that same optimistic spirit, that same belief that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. "I made your favorite," I said, leading him toward the dining room. "Pot roast with all the fixings." "You're the best, Grandma," he said. But I noticed something different in his voice that evening. There was an undertone of nervousness, a quality I'd never heard before. He kept glancing at his parents, sharing looks that seemed loaded with unspoken conversations. We sat down to dinner as we had countless times before. But the atmosphere felt different. The conversation was stilted, punctuated by long silences and careful glances. David pushed his food around his plate without eating much, while Rebecca kept checking her phone, her face growing more tense with each notification. "How's the job search going, Tommy?" I asked, trying to fill the uncomfortable silence. Tommy straightened in his chair, and I saw something spark in his eyes. "Actually, Grandma, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. Marcus and we've been working on this business plan for months now. We've found the perfect food truck, and we've got investors lined up, but we need a little help with the down payment." I felt my stomach tighten. In my 73 years, I'd learned to recognize the particular tone people used when they were about to ask for money. It was different from ordinary conversation, tinged with hope and desperation in equal measure. "What kind of help?" I asked carefully. Rebecca leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly on the table. "Mom, Tommy has a real opportunity here. This could be his future, his chance to build something meaningful. I understand that, sweetheart, but—" "The thing is, Grandma," Tommy interrupted, his words coming faster now, "we need someone to co-sign the loan. Just as a formality, you understand. We have the business plan, we have the location scouted, we even have our first month's worth of events booked. But the bank wants a co-signer with good credit and collateral." The room seemed to grow smaller around me. I looked at my grandson, this young man I'd loved since the moment he was born, and I saw so much hope in his eyes. But I also saw something else, a kind of expectation, as if my agreement was already assumed. "Tommy, honey, how much are we talking about here?" $75,000, he said quickly. "I know it sounds like a lot, but this food truck business is really taking off. Marcus and I have done all the research. We know exactly what we're doing." $75,000. The number hung in the air like a weight. I thought about my house, the home Robert and I had worked so hard to pay off, the sanctuary that represented everything we'd built together. I thought about my fixed income, the Social Security and small pension that barely covered my monthly expenses. "Tommy, that's a lot of money," I said slowly. "And co-signing a loan means if something goes wrong, I'm responsible for the entire amount." "Nothing will go wrong," Rebecca said firmly. "Tommy's got a good head on his shoulders, and Marcus comes from a family of entrepreneurs. They know what they're doing. But I'd lived long enough to know that even the best-laid plans could crumble. I'd seen too many people lose everything because they'd put their faith in someone else's dreams. I'd watched neighbors, friends, and family members learn the hard way that love and business don't always mix well. "I need to think about this," I said finally. The disappointment in Tommy's eyes was immediate and sharp. "Grandma, we need to move on this quickly. Someone else is looking at the truck, and if we don't put the deposit down by Friday, we'll lose it." "That's only 3 days away," I protested. "Which is why we need to know now," Rebecca said, her voice taking on an edge I'd rarely heard before. "Mom, this is Tommy's future we're talking about. This is his chance to build something real, something lasting." I looked around the table at my family. These people I loved more than life itself, and I felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. But I also felt the weight of responsibility, the understanding that at 73, I couldn't afford to make a mistake that could cost me my home. "I understand how important this is," I said carefully, "but $75,000 is my entire savings, and more. If something went wrong, nothing will go wrong," Tommy said again. But his voice was strained now, tinged with frustration. "Grandma, I wouldn't ask if I wasn't absolutely sure about this." The conversation continued for another hour, with Rebecca and Tommy presenting their case with increasing urgency, while David remained mostly silent, occasionally offering supportive nods, but never quite meeting my eyes. I found myself thinking about Robert, wondering what he would have done in this situation. He'd always been the practical one, the one who made the hard decisions about money and the future. By the time they left that evening, nothing had been resolved. Tommy hugged me goodbye, but it felt different, stilted and formal, as if something had already changed between us. Rebecca kissed my cheek and whispered, "Please think about this, Mom. Really think about it." But I'd already been thinking about it. I'd been thinking about it from the moment Tommy mentioned the loan, and every thought led me to the same conclusion. I couldn't risk my home, no matter how much I loved my grandson. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of my house settling around me. I thought about Tommy as a little boy, running through these same halls, playing in the backyard where Robert had built him a treehouse. I thought about Rebecca as a young mother, bringing him here every weekend, using my kitchen to prepare his bottles, my living room for his first steps. This house wasn't just my home. It was the repository of our family's history, the place where 3 generations had shared meals, celebrations, and quiet moments. How could I risk losing it, even for someone I loved as much as Tommy? But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to disappoint the people who mattered most to me. I couldn't escape the knowledge that sometimes loving someone means saying the thing they don't want to hear. The next morning brought a phone call from Rebecca. Her voice was tight with barely controlled emotion as she asked, "Have you made your decision, Mom?" "I'm still thinking about it," I said, though we both knew I'd already decided. "Mom, please, Tommy called me last night, and he's really counting on this. He's been working toward this dream for months. Don't you want to help him succeed?" Of course I wanted to help him succeed. I wanted it more than anything. But I also wanted to keep my home, to maintain the security that Robert and I had worked so hard to build. I wanted to be able to sleep at night without worrying about loan payments I couldn't afford. "Rebecca, honey, I love Tommy more than words can express, but $75,000 is more than I can handle. If something went wrong with the business, I could lose everything. Nothing will go wrong," she said again, but her voice lacked conviction now. "Mom, he's your grandson, your only grandson. Doesn't that mean something?" It meant everything. That was the problem. It meant so much that I'd been lying awake for 2 nights, wrestling with a decision that felt impossible either way. The rest of the week passed in a blur of phone calls and text messages. Tommy called twice, each conversation more strained than the last. Rebecca called every day, her tone growing increasingly desperate. Even David, who rarely spoke to me directly about family matters, sent a text message asking me to please consider helping Tommy. By Friday morning, I knew what I had to do. I called Tommy and asked him to come over that afternoon. I needed to tell him in person, to look him in the eye, and explain why I couldn't help him in the way he wanted. He arrived at 3 o'clock, his face hopeful and expectant. We sat in my living room, the same room where I'd read him bedtime stories when he was little, where I'd helped him with homework during his teenage years, where I'd listened to his dreams and fears throughout his life. "Grandma, please tell me you have good news," he said, settling into Robert's old recliner. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his expectation and my own heartbreak. "Tommy, I love you more than anything in this world. You know that, don't you?" His face fell immediately. "But you won't help me." "It's not that I won't help you," I said carefully. "It's that I can't risk my home. This house is all I have left of your grandfather, and it's my security. If something went wrong with the business, I could lose everything." "Nothing will go wrong," he said, but the words sounded hollow now, repeated too many times to carry weight. You can't guarantee that, honey. Business is risky, even with the best planning. And at my age, I can't afford to take that kind of risk. Tommy stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where he'd spent countless hours as a child, watching the seasons change in my backyard. So that's it? You're just gonna let this opportunity slip away? I'm not letting anything slip away, I said firmly. I'm making a responsible decision about my financial future. It's not about money, Grandma. It's about family. It's about believing in me. Those words hit me like a physical blow. Tommy, I do believe in you. I believe in your intelligence, your work ethic, your determination. But believing in you doesn't mean I have to risk my home. He turned back to me, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I thought you loved me. I do love you. That's why this is so hard. But love doesn't mean saying yes to everything. Sometimes love means protecting what we have so we can continue to be there for the people we care about. Tommy stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something change in his expression. The hope was gone, replaced by disappointment, and something that looked almost like resentment. I need to call Marcus, he said quietly. I need to tell him we lost the truck. He left without saying goodbye, and I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by the silence of my empty house. For the first time in years, the familiar sounds of home felt hollow, inadequate to fill the space that seemed to have opened up between me and my family. That evening Rebecca called, her voice sharp with anger. Mom, how could you do this to him? How could you crush his dreams like that? I didn't crush his dreams, I said, exhaustion weighing down every word. I made a decision I can live with. He's devastated. He's been working toward this for months, and you just threw it away. I protected my home, Rebecca. I protected the security your father and I built together. I'm sorry Tommy is disappointed, but I can't risk everything for a business venture. It's not just a business venture, Mom. It's his future. And you chose a house over your grandson's future. The accusation hung between us like a chasm. I wanted to explain that it wasn't that simple, that the choice wasn't between a house and Tommy's future, but between responsible financial planning and reckless risk-taking. But I could hear in Rebecca's voice that she'd already made up her mind about what I'd done. I hope someday you'll understand, I said quietly. I understand perfectly, she replied. I understand that when your family needed you most, you chose to protect yourself instead. The line went dead, leaving me alone with the echo of her words and the growing realization that my decision, while financially sound, had cost me something precious. The easy, unconditional love of my family. Chapter 2. The dinner that changed everything. 3 weeks passed in uncomfortable silence. The phone calls stopped. The weekend visits ended. And I found myself living in a quiet that felt more like exile than peace. I told myself that time would heal the rift, that Rebecca and Tommy would eventually understand why I'd made the choice I did. I told myself that families weather storms like this, that love ultimately prevails over disappointment. I was wrong. The invitation came on a Tuesday, delivered not by a warm phone call but by a brief text message from Rebecca. Sunday dinner at my place, 5 p.m. Please come. The formality of it stung. For 45 years, family dinners had been casual affairs, arrangements made with quick calls and easy familiarity. But this invitation felt different, weighted with significance I couldn't quite understand. I spent the week preparing for what I hoped would be a reconciliation. I bought a new dress, something cheerful in blue that I thought Rebecca would like. I stopped by the bakery and picked up Tommy's favorite chocolate cake, the same one I'd gotten for his birthday, every year since he was 5. I even wrote a little speech in my head, words I hoped would bridge the gap that had opened between us. Rebecca's house was a modest 2-story colonial in the suburbs, The kind of place where young families build their lives and their dreams. David had bought it 15 years ago, back when his construction business was thriving and the future looked bright. But like so many others, they'd struggled through the economic downturns, and I knew they'd been barely keeping up with the mortgage payments. I arrived at 5 o'clock exactly, clutching the cake box and a bottle of wine I'd picked up at the grocery store. Rebecca answered the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. "Mom, you look nice," she said, accepting my kiss on the cheek with the kind of politeness reserved for acquaintances, not family. "Thank you, sweetheart. I brought Tommy's favorite cake." "That's nice," she said, but her tone suggested it was anything but nice. "Come in. Dinner's almost ready." The dining room was set for 4, with the good china that had been a wedding gift from Robert and me 20 years ago. Tommy was already seated at the table, his face carefully neutral, while David stood by the window, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Hello, Tommy," I said, leaning down to kiss his forehead, as I had 1,000 times before. "Hi, Grandma," he replied, but he didn't look at me, and his voice carried none of the warmth I'd grown accustomed to over the years. The meal began with stilted conversation about the weather, David's work, and Rebecca's job at the insurance office. We talked around the elephant in the room, dancing carefully around any mention of food trucks, business loans, or the decision that had driven a wedge between us. But I could feel the tension building like storm clouds, heavy and electric, waiting for the moment when the careful politeness would crack and the real conversation would begin. It came during dessert, as I was cutting generous slices of chocolate cake and trying to restore some sense of normalcy to the evening. Tommy had been pushing his food around his plate, barely eating, and I could see the frustration building in his eyes. "Grandma," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the artificial cheerfulness I'd been trying to maintain. "I need to ask you something." I set down the cake knife and looked at him, seeing so much of Robert in his serious expression, so much of the man who'd taught me that difficult conversations were best approached with honesty and courage. "Of course, honey." "What is it?" "Marcus and we found another investor. Someone who believes in what we're doing, who's willing to take a chance on us." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "That's wonderful, Tommy. I'm so happy for you. But the thing is," he continued, his voice gaining strength, "we need a co-signer for the loan. Someone with good credit and collateral." My heart sank. "Tommy, we've already talked about this. I can't—" "Just hear me out," he said, holding up his hand. "This investor is only putting up $60,000. We need someone to co-sign for the remaining $15,000. It's a much smaller risk. $15,000. Still a fortune to someone living on a fixed income. Still enough to jeopardize my financial security, but significantly less than the original amount." I looked around the table at my family, seeing hope in Tommy's eyes, expectation in Rebecca's face, and something I couldn't quite read in David's expression. "Tommy, I understand this is important to you," I began carefully, "but even $15,000 is more than I can afford to lose. If something goes wrong, nothing will go wrong." Rebecca interrupted, her voice sharp with impatience. "Mom, this is a much smaller amount. Surely you can manage $15,000. "It's not about managing it," I said, feeling my own frustration beginning to rise. "It's about the risk. If the business fails, I'm responsible for the entire amount. At my age, I can't afford to take that kind of gamble." "It's not a gamble," Tommy said, his voice rising. "It's an investment in my future. It's my chance to build something real, something meaningful. I know that, honey, and I want that for you more than anything. But I can't risk my home. This house is all I have left of your grandfather, and it's my security blanket. Without it, I'd have nowhere to go." You'd have us, Rebecca said quietly. You'd always have us. But there was something in her tone that made me doubt the sincerity of that statement. Something cold and calculating that I'd never heard before. I appreciate that, sweetheart. But I need to be responsible for myself. I can't depend on anyone else for my security. So you won't do it? Tommy said, his voice flat with disappointment. You won't help me. I looked at my grandson, this young man I'd loved since before he was born, and I felt my heart breaking. Tommy, I love you more than words can express, but I can't risk my home for this business venture. I'm sorry. The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca set down her fork with a sharp click against her plate, and David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Tommy stared at me with eyes that seemed to see through me, to judge me, and find me wanting. I see, Rebecca said finally, her voice cold and distant. So when it really matters, when your family needs you most, you choose to protect yourself instead of helping the people you claim to love. That's not fair, I protested. I'm not choosing to protect myself. I'm making a responsible financial decision. You're choosing a house over your grandson's future, she said, standing up from the table. You're choosing money over family. That's not true, I said, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. Rebecca walked to the window, her back to me, her shoulders rigid with anger. Do you know what Tommy's been going through these past few weeks? Do you know how devastated he's been? I know he's disappointed, I said quietly. I'm disappointed too, but I can't risk everything for a business venture no matter how much I love him. It's not just a business venture, she said, whirling around to face me. It's his dream. It's everything he's worked toward for the past 2 years. And you're destroying it because you're too selfish to help. The word selfish hit me like a slap. I'd never considered myself selfish, had always tried to put my family's needs before my own. But here was my daughter, the child I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, calling me selfish because I wouldn't risk my home for her son's business dream. I'm not selfish, I said, my voice trembling with hurt and anger. I'm being practical. I'm being responsible. You're being a coward, Tommy said suddenly, his voice quiet but sharp as a blade. You're afraid to take a chance, afraid to believe in something bigger than yourself. Tommy, that's enough, David said, speaking for the first time since we'd sat down to dinner. But Tommy ignored his father, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to look away. All my life you've told me to follow my dreams, to work hard and never give up. But when I actually try to do that, when I ask for your help to make it happen, you turn your back on me. I'm not turning my back on you, I said, tears beginning to well in my eyes. I'm trying to protect what little security I have left. Your security is more important than my future, he said. And it wasn't a question. It's not about importance, I said desperately. It's about reality. I'm 73 years old, living on a fixed income. If I lose my house, I have nothing. Nothing. You have us, Rebecca said again, but her voice lacked conviction. Do I? I asked, looking around the table at these people I'd loved unconditionally for decades. Because right now it feels like I'm losing all of you because I won't risk my home for a business loan. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken accusations and disappointed expectations. I could feel the family I'd helped build, the relationships I'd nurtured for decades, crumbling around me because I dared to say no to something I couldn't afford. I think you should go, Rebecca said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca, please, I said, standing up from the table. Let's talk about this. Let's find another way. There is no other way, she said, not looking at me. You've made your choice. You've chosen your house over your family. That's not what I've done, I protested. but I could hear the doubt in my own voice. "Then prove it," Tommy said, leaning forward in his chair. "Co-sign the loan. Show us that we matter more than your precious security." I looked at him. This young man who'd been the light of my life for 22 years. And I felt the weight of his expectation crushing down on me. Part of me wanted to say yes, to give him what he wanted, to restore the easy love we'd shared for so long. But the practical part of me, the part that had learned hard lessons about money and security over 7 decades of life, couldn't let go of the fear. "I can't," I whispered. "I'm sorry, but I can't." Tommy stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Then I guess we have nothing more to talk about." He walked out of the dining room, and I heard his footsteps on the stairs, heard his bedroom door slam with a finality that made my heart ache. David mumbled something about checking on him, and followed, leaving me alone with Rebecca in the dining room, where we'd shared so many family celebrations over the years. "I'm disappointed in you, Mom," she said quietly, not looking at me. "I really thought you'd do the right thing." "I am doing the right thing," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "I'm protecting myself so I can continue to be there for all of you. You're not there for us," she said, finally turning to face me. "You're there for yourself. You're so worried about your own security that you can't see past your own fears. That's not fair," I said, feeling tears spill down my cheeks. "I've always been there for you. For all of you. I've always put family first. Until now," she said. "Until it actually costs you something." I wanted to argue, to explain that I'd sacrificed for my family countless times over the years, that I'd given up my own dreams to help raise Tommy, that I'd supported them through every crisis and celebration, but the words felt hollow in the face of her disappointment. "I should go," I said finally, gathering my purse and the cake that no one had touched. "Yes," Rebecca said, her voice cold and final. "You should." I walked to the front door on unsteady legs, my heart pounding with the realization that I was losing my family over a decision that felt both right and wrong at the same time. As I reached for the door handle, I turned back to look at Rebecca, hoping to see some softening in her expression, some sign that this rift could be healed. But her face was hard, closed off, the face of a stranger rather than the daughter I'd raised and loved for 45 years. "Rebecca," I said one last time, "I love you. I love Tommy. That hasn't changed." "Love isn't enough, Mom," she said quietly. "Sometimes love means making sacrifices for the people you care about, and you're not willing to make that sacrifice." I left her house that evening knowing that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship, that the easy intimacy we'd shared for decades had been replaced by something colder and more fragile. As I drove home through the November darkness, I wondered if I'd made the right choice, if protecting my financial security was worth the cost of losing my family's love. But even as I questioned my decision, I knew I couldn't change it. I couldn't risk my home, my security, my future for a business venture that might fail. I couldn't gamble with the only thing I had left of the life Robert and I had built together. That night I sat in my empty house, surrounded by the silence of my solitude, and wondered if saying no to the people we love is sometimes the most painful kind of love we can offer. I wondered if protecting ourselves is always selfish, or if sometimes it's the only way to ensure we can continue to be there for the people who matter most. I didn't have answers to those questions. All I knew was that I'd made a choice, and I'd have to live with the consequences, whatever they might be. Chapter 3. The Ultimatum. The weeks following that disastrous dinner felt like living in a twilight zone where the familiar rhythms of my life had been disrupted by an absence that echoed through every room of my house. No weekend visits, no phone calls asking for advice, no spontaneous stops by Rebecca and Tommy that had been the highlight of my weeks for years. I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, following the routines that had structured my days since Robert's death 5 years ago. I tended to my garden, preparing it for winter, wrapping the delicate plants in burlap, and storing the garden tools in the shed Robert had built with his own hands. I volunteered at the local food bank on Wednesdays, sorting donations and serving meals to families who understood what it meant to worry about having enough. But even these familiar activities felt hollow, without the anticipation of sharing them with my family. I'd catch myself planning stories to tell Tommy about the characters I met at the food bank, or thinking about recipes I wanted to try for Rebecca's family dinners. Then I'd remember that those conversations might never happen again, and the loneliness would wash over me like a cold wave. It was during one of these lonely afternoons in late November that I decided to reach out. I couldn't stand the silence anymore, couldn't bear the thought that my grandson might be struggling while I sat in my house, paralyzed by pride and stubbornness. I called Tommy's cell phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed the number I'd memorized years ago. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail, and his voice sounded so young and hopeful in the recorded message that it made my heart ache. "Tommy, it's Grandma," I said after the beep. "I know things have been difficult between us lately, but I want you to know that I love you. I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry this situation has come between us. Please call me back when you're ready to talk." He didn't call back that day, or the next, or the day after that. I tried Rebecca's number with the same result. Straight to voicemail. My message left hanging in the digital void with no response. I began to wonder if I'd lost them permanently, if my refusal to co-sign the loan had created a rift that couldn't be healed. The thought terrified me more than any financial risk ever could. It was David who finally broke the silence. He called on a Thursday evening in early December, his voice careful and formal, in a way that immediately put me on edge. "Margaret, I hope you're doing well," he said, and I could hear the strain in his voice. "I'm fine, David. How are you? How's the family?" "That's actually why I'm calling," he said, and I heard him take a deep breath. "Rebecca asked me to invite you to dinner this Sunday. She says she wants to talk." My heart leaped with hope. "Of course I'll come." "What time?" 6 o'clock. And Margaret—" He paused, and I could hear the weight of something unspoken in his silence. "She's pretty upset. This whole situation with Tommy's loan has been hard on all of us." "I understand," I said, though I wasn't sure I understood anything anymore. "I'll be there." The rest of the week passed in a blur of nervous preparation. I cleaned my house from top to bottom, as if having a spotless home would somehow make up for the disappointment I'd caused. I bought new clothes, spent extra time on my hair and makeup, and practiced conversations in my head, trying to find the right words to rebuild the bridges I'd burned. But nothing could have prepared me for what awaited me at Rebecca's house that Sunday evening. I arrived at 6 o'clock sharp, carrying a bouquet of flowers from my garden and a homemade apple pie, Rebecca's favorite since childhood. The house looked the same from the outside, but something felt different as I approached the front door. The curtains were drawn, and the warm light I usually saw spilling from the windows seemed dimmer somehow. Rebecca answered the door wearing a black dress that made her look older, more severe than I'd ever seen her. Her smile was polite but cold, the kind of expression she might wear for a business meeting rather than a family dinner. "Mom, thank you for coming," she said, accepting my kiss on the cheek with the same distant politeness she'd shown weeks earlier. "Thank you for inviting me," I replied, offering her the flowers. "I've missed you all so much." She took the flowers without comment and led me into the living room, where Tommy and David were waiting. Tommy was sitting in his father's chair, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable. David stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, looking like a man preparing for an unpleasant task. "Hello, Tommy," I said, moving toward him with my arms open for a hug. "Hi, Grandma," he replied. But he didn't stand up, didn't move to embrace me. He just sat there, looking at me with eyes that seemed to belong to a stranger. The awkwardness of the moment stretched between us like a chasm. I lowered my arms, feeling foolish and rejected, and took a seat on the couch across from him. The same couch where I'd rocked him to sleep when he was a baby, where I'd read him stories and helped him with homework for years. "Can I get you something to drink, Mom?" Rebecca asked, her voice maintaining that careful politeness that felt more hurtful than outright anger. "Just water, please," I said, though my throat felt so tight I wasn't sure I could swallow anything. She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone with Tommy and David. The silence was oppressive, filled with all the things we weren't saying, all the hurt feelings and disappointed expectations that had built up over the past month. "How's school going, Tommy?" I asked, trying to bridge the gap with ordinary conversation. "I graduated in May, Grandma," he said flatly. Remember? Of course I remembered. I'd been at his graduation, had cried with pride as he walked across the stage, had taken dozens of photos of him in his cap and gown. But in my nervousness, I'd fallen back on the kind of small talk that had always been easy between us, forgetting that nothing was easy anymore. "I'm sorry," I said. "I meant, how's the job search going?" "It's not," he said, his voice bitter. "Turns out when you don't have startup capital for your business, you have to take whatever minimum wage job you can find. I'm working at the hardware store now, making $9 an hour." The disappointment in his voice cut through me like a knife. I wanted to say something encouraging, to remind him that many successful people had started with humble jobs, but I knew my words would ring hollow. He wasn't just disappointed about the job. He was disappointed in me. Rebecca returned with my water and took a seat beside Tommy, creating a united front across from me. David remained standing by the fireplace, his role in whatever was about to happen unclear. "Mom, we need to talk," Rebecca said, her voice taking on the serious tone she'd used when Tommy was a teenager and had gotten into trouble at school. "I'm listening," I said, though I felt like I was preparing for a blow. "The situation with Tommy's loan has gone on long enough," she said. "It's been over a month now, and nothing's been resolved. Tommy's dreams are on hold, his future is uncertain, and our family is falling apart." "I know," I said quietly. "I hate that this has come between us." "Then do something about it," Tommy said, leaning forward in his chair. "Make this right, Grandma. Help me get this loan." I felt the familiar weight of expectation settling on my shoulders, the same pressure I'd felt a month ago when this conversation first began. But now it felt heavier, more desperate, tinged with the knowledge that my family's love seemed to depend on my answer. "Tommy, I've explained why I can't co-sign the loan," I said carefully. "It's not that I don't want to help you." "But you won't help me," he interrupted. "When it really matters, when I need you most, you choose your house over me." "It's not about choosing the house over you," I said, feeling tears prick at my eyes. "It's about protecting my financial security so I can continue to be there for all of you." "You're not there for us," Rebecca said, her voice sharp with frustration. "You're here physically, but you're not really here. You're not part of our lives anymore." "That's not my choice," I protested. "You're the ones who stopped calling, stopped visiting." "Because we're hurt, Mom," Rebecca said, her voice breaking slightly. "We're hurt that when we needed you most, you let us down." "I didn't let you down," I said. But even as I spoke the words, I wondered if they were true. Had I let them down? Was my refusal to take this risk a betrayal of the love we'd shared for so long? "Marcus found another investor," Tommy said suddenly, his voice tight with emotion. "Someone who believes in our dream enough to take a chance on us." "That's wonderful," I said, feeling a surge of relief. "I'm so happy for you." The thing is, he continued, this investor will only cover part of the loan. We still need a co-signer for $25,000. $25,000. More than the $15,000 he'd asked for at the last dinner, but less than the original $75,000. I felt like I was being pulled into a negotiation I didn't want to be part of. A gradual erosion of my resistance through smaller and smaller asks. Tommy, I can't— This is it, Grandma, he said, his voice urgent. This is my last chance. If I don't get this loan, the opportunity is gone forever. Marcus will find another partner, and I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. There will be other opportunities, I said weakly. No, there won't, Rebecca said firmly. This is it. This is Tommy's chance to build something real, something meaningful. And you're the only one who can make it happen. I looked around the room at my family, these people I'd loved unconditionally for decades, and I felt the weight of their disappointment crushing down on me. But I also felt the weight of my own fears, the terror of losing my home, my security, everything Robert and I had worked so hard to build. I need time to think, I said finally. There is no time, Tommy said, standing up abruptly. I need an answer tonight. The investor is meeting with someone else tomorrow, and if I don't have the co-signer lined up, he's going to choose the other option. Tonight? I felt panic rising in my chest. Tommy, this is a major financial decision. I can't make it on the spot. You've had over a month to think about it, Rebecca said coldly. How much more time do you need? This is different, I said. $25,000 is still a significant amount of money. It's a lot less than the original amount, Tommy pointed out. We're trying to meet you halfway here. But it didn't feel like meeting me halfway. It felt like being cornered, pressured into a decision that could destroy my financial security. I thought about my monthly expenses, my fixed income, the reality of living on Social Security and a small pension. $25,000 might as well have been $1 million. I'm sorry, I said, standing up from the couch. I can't do it. I just can't risk that much money. The silence that followed was deafening. Tommy stared at me with undisguised disappointment, while Rebecca's face went through a series of emotions, hurt, anger, and finally, a cold resolution that frightened me more than her anger ever could. I see, she said quietly. So that's your final answer. I'm sorry, I repeated, feeling helpless in the face of their disappointment. I wish there was another way. There is another way, Rebecca said, standing up to face me. You could choose to help your family instead of protecting yourself. I'm not just protecting myself, I said desperately. I'm protecting my future, my security. Your security is more important than Tommy's future, she said. And it wasn't a question. That's not fair, I said, tears streaming down my face now. You're making this about choosing between— I'm making this about priorities, she interrupted. About what matters most to you. And apparently, what matters most is that house. It's not just a house, I said, my voice breaking. It's my home. It's all I have left of your father. It's my security blanket, my safety net. Without it, I have nothing. You have us, Rebecca said, but her voice was cold, distant. Or you did. The implication hung in the air between us like a threat. I looked at my daughter, this woman I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, and I saw a stranger, someone who would use my love for her and Tommy as a weapon, who would threaten to withdraw her love if I didn't give her what she wanted. What are you saying? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. I'm saying that families take care of each other, she said, her voice steady and cold. And when someone refuses to take care of their family, maybe they don't deserve to be part of it. Rebecca, please, I said, reaching out to touch her arm. Don't do this. Don't let money come between us." She pulled away from my touch, her eyes hard with determination. "I'm not letting money come between us, Mom. You are." "That's not true," I protested, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. "Then prove it," Tommy said, moving to stand beside his mother. "Co-sign the loan. Show us that we matter more than your precious house." I looked at them, standing together against me, and I felt more alone than I had since Robert's death. These were the people I'd loved most in the world, the ones I'd thought would love me no matter what. But now their love felt conditional, dependent on my willingness to risk everything for Tommy's dreams. "I can't," I whispered. "I'm sorry, but I can't." Rebecca nodded slowly, as if she'd expected this answer. "Then I think it's time for you to go." "Rebecca, please," I said, my voice breaking. "Let's talk about this. Let's find another solution." "There is no other solution," she said, moving toward the front door. "You've made your choice. Now you have to live with it." I followed her to the door, my heart pounding with the realization that I was about to lose my family over a decision that felt both right and wrong at the same time. As she opened the door, I turned back to look at Tommy and David, hoping to see some sign of support, some indication that not everyone in my family had turned against me. But Tommy was staring at the floor, his jaw set in disappointment, while David avoided my eyes entirely. I was alone in this, completely and utterly alone. "I love you," I said to Rebecca as I stepped onto the porch. "I love all of you. That hasn't changed. Love isn't enough, Mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes love means making sacrifices, and you're not willing to make that sacrifice." The door closed behind me with a finality that felt like a judgment. I stood on the porch for a long moment, staring at the house where I'd shared so many happy memories, wondering if I'd ever be welcome there again. As I drove home through the December darkness, I replayed the conversation in my mind, looking for some other way I could have handled it, some magic words that might have preserved both my financial security and my family's love. But I couldn't find them. I'd been faced with an impossible choice, and I'd chosen the path that felt most responsible, most practical. But as I pulled into my driveway and looked at my house, the house that had cost me my family, I wondered if I'd made the right choice after all. The building that had once represented security and comfort now felt like a prison, beautiful and well-maintained, but empty of the love that had made it a home. That night I lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of my house settling around me, and I realized that sometimes the most responsible choice isn't the right choice. Sometimes protecting ourselves costs more than we can afford to lose, but it was too late for those realizations. I'd made my decision, and my family had made theirs. Now I had to learn to live with the consequences, whatever they might be. Chapter 4. The Suitcase. The next few weeks passed in a haze of loneliness and second-guessing. Christmas was approaching, and for the first time in 45 years, I didn't have plans to spend it with my family. I found myself wandering through the house, looking at the Christmas decorations Robert and I had collected over the years, wondering if there was any point in putting them up for an audience of one. The silence was broken by occasional phone calls from friends who'd heard about the rift through the small-town gossip network. They offered sympathy and support, but their words felt hollow. How could I explain that I'd chosen financial security over my family's dreams? How could I make them understand that sometimes love means saying no? I threw myself into volunteer work at the food bank, spending extra hours sorting donations and serving meals to families who understood what it meant to struggle. Their gratitude for small kindnesses reminded me that there were worse things than family disappointment, but it didn't fill the ache in my chest that grew stronger each day. It was during one of these volunteer shifts that I met Eleanor, a woman about my age who'd been coming to the food bank for 6 months. She was well dressed despite her circumstances, with the kind of dignity that comes from a lifetime of good choices that had somehow led to bad outcomes. My daughter asked me to co-sign a loan for her business. She told me during a quiet moment between serving shifts. When it failed, I lost my house. That's how I ended up here. Her words hit me like a physical blow. Here was the cautionary tale I'd been afraid of, the real-world consequence of the risk I'd refused to take. But looking at Eleanor, seeing the strength and resilience in her eyes despite her circumstances, I wondered if she regretted her choice. "Do you wish you hadn't helped her?" I asked. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, ladling soup into bowls with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to find purpose in service. "I wish the business had succeeded," she said finally. "But I don't regret helping her. Family is all we really have in the end, even if it cost you your home. Especially then," she said, looking at me with eyes that held more wisdom than I felt comfortable confronting. "Houses can be replaced. Family relationships, once broken, are much harder to repair." I left the food bank that day with Eleanor's words echoing in my mind. Had I been wrong to prioritize my financial security over my family's needs? Had I let fear make me selfish, choosing the safety of my house over the love of my grandson? But even as I questioned my decision, I couldn't shake the practical reality of my situation. I was 73 years old, living on a fixed income, with no ability to recover from a financial disaster. If Tommy's business failed, I would lose everything. Not just my house, but my independence, my dignity, my ability to take care of myself. These thoughts were still churning in my mind when Rebecca called on a Tuesday evening in mid-December. Her voice was strained, formal, as if she were calling a business associate rather than her mother. "Mom, I need you to come to dinner on Sunday," she said without preamble. "Of course," I said, hope fluttering in my chest. "I'd love to. This isn't a social invitation," she said quickly. "We need to discuss some things as a family." The coldness in her tone made my stomach clench with anxiety. "What kind of things?" "We'll talk about it when you get here," she said. 6 o'clock. Don't be late." The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone and wondering what new crisis awaited me. I spent the rest of the week in a state of nervous anticipation, my mind racing through possible scenarios. None of them good. Sunday arrived gray and cold, with the kind of December weather that makes everything look bleak and unwelcoming. I dressed carefully, choosing a blue dress that Rebecca had always liked, and drove to her house with my heart pounding in my chest. The scene that greeted me was strangely formal. Rebecca answered the door in a black dress that made her look like she was attending a funeral, while Tommy was dressed in his best suit, looking older and more serious than I'd ever seen him. Even David was dressed up, standing by the fireplace like a witness to some solemn proceeding. "Mom, thank you for coming," Rebecca said, her voice carefully neutral. "Thank you for inviting me," I replied, though it didn't feel like an invitation so much as a summons. We sat down to dinner, a simple meal of roast chicken and vegetables that felt more like a last meal than a family gathering. The conversation was stilted, focused on safe topics like the weather and David's work, carefully avoiding any mention of loans or business ventures. But I could feel the tension building, the weight of unspoken words hanging over the table like a storm cloud. Tommy barely touched his food, his eyes fixed on his plate with the kind of intensity that suggested he was rehearsing something in his mind. Rebecca kept glancing at the clock, as if we were operating on some kind of schedule I wasn't aware of. It was during dessert that the real conversation finally began. Rebecca had served store-bought pie, a departure from the homemade dessert she usually preferred, and the symbolism wasn't lost on me. Even the food felt temporary, disposable, as if this might be the last meal we'd share together. "Mom?" Rebecca said, setting down her fork and looking directly at me. "We need to talk about your living situation." My living situation? I repeated, confused by the sudden shift in topic. Your house, Tommy said, speaking for the first time since we'd sat down. We need to talk about your house. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. What about my house? It's too big for one person, Rebecca said, her voice taking on the reasonable tone she used when she was about to say something unreasonable. You're rattling around in there all alone, and it's not healthy for someone your age. I'm perfectly healthy, I protested. And I love my house. It's my home. It's also expensive to maintain, David added, joining the conversation for the first time. The property taxes alone must be a burden on your fixed income. I looked around the table at my family, seeing them aligned against me in a way that made my chest tighten with anxiety. What are you suggesting? There are some lovely senior living communities in the area, Rebecca said, her voice carefully cheerful. Places where you'd have your own apartment, but also access to social activities, meals, medical care, if you need it. I don't need medical care, I said, my voice rising with panic. I don't need to be in a senior living community. I need to be in my own home. Mom, be reasonable, Tommy said, his voice taking on the patient tone people use with difficult children. You're living in a 4-bedroom house by yourself. It doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense to me, I said, standing up from the table. It's my home. It's where I belong. It's also worth a lot of money, Rebecca said quietly. Money that could help Tommy start his business. The words hung in the air like an accusation. I stared at my daughter, this woman I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, and I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. You want me to sell my house to fund Tommy's business, I said, and it wasn't a question. We want you to make a practical decision about your living situation, Rebecca said, but her eyes wouldn't meet mine. A practical decision that happens to solve your financial problems, I said, my voice bitter with hurt and anger. It would solve everyone's problems, Tommy said, leaning forward in his chair. You'd be in a safer living situation, and I'd have the capital I need to start my business. My house is my security, I said, my voice trembling. It's all I have left of your grandfather. It's my safety net, my inheritance, my legacy. What's the point of having a legacy if you're not willing to use it to help your family? Rebecca asked, and there was something hard in her voice that I'd never heard before. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw a stranger. Someone who would ask me to give up my home, my security, my independence for the sake of her son's business dreams. Someone who would use my love for them as a weapon against me. I can't believe you're asking me to do this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I can't believe you're refusing, she replied. After everything we've been through, after all the ways we've taken care of you over the years, you won't help us when we need it most. Taken care of me? I said, my voice rising. I've been taking care of myself for 5 years since your father died. I've been independent, self-sufficient. You've been stubborn, Tommy interrupted. You've been so focused on protecting yourself that you can't see how much you're hurting the people who love you. I'm not hurting you, I said desperately. I'm protecting myself so I can continue to be there for you. You're not there for us, Rebecca said, standing up to face me. You're there for yourself. You're so worried about your own security that you can't see past your own fears. My fears are realistic, I said, tears streaming down my face. If I sell my house and Tommy's business fails, I'll have nothing. Nothing. You'll have us, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Will I? I asked, looking around the table at these people who felt like strangers. Because right now, it feels like I'm losing all of you because I won't give up my home. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, the sound of my own breathing, the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But I couldn't hear any words of comfort, any assurance that my family's love wasn't conditional on my willingness to sacrifice my security for their dreams. "I think you should go," Rebecca said finally, her voice cold and final. "Rebecca, please," I said, reaching out to touch her arm. "Don't do this. Don't let money come between us." She pulled away from my touch, her eyes hard with determination. "You're the one letting money come between us, Mom. You're choosing your house over your family. I'm choosing my security over financial ruin," I said. But even as I spoke the words, I wondered if they were true. Was I being reasonable? Or was I being selfish? Was I protecting myself? Or was I hurting the people I loved most? "Then pack your things," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What?" I said, sure I'd misheard her. "Pack your things," she repeated, her voice growing stronger. "If you won't help your family, if you won't make the sacrifice that love requires, then you're not welcome in this house." "Rebecca, you can't be serious," I said, feeling the world tilt beneath my feet. "I'm perfectly serious," she said, and I could see in her eyes that she meant it. "I won't have someone in my home who cares more about money than family." "It's not about money," I protested, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. "It's exactly about money," Tommy said, standing up to join his mother. "It's about your refusal to help when we need you most." I looked at David, hoping for some support, some voice of reason in this madness. But he was staring at his hands, his face pale with discomfort, clearly unwilling to intervene in a battle he wanted no part of. "I can't believe you're doing this," I said, my voice breaking. "I can't believe you're choosing money over family." "We're not choosing money over family," Rebecca said coldly. "We're choosing family over selfishness, and you've made it clear where your priorities lie." "My priorities are with my family," I said desperately. "You are my family. You're the most important thing in my life." "Then prove it," Tommy said, his voice hard with challenge. "Sell the house. Help me start my business. Show us that we matter more than your precious security." I looked at him, this young man I'd loved since before he was born, and I felt my heart breaking. He was asking me to give up everything. My home, my security, my independence, for the sake of his dreams. And maybe, in his mind, that was what love required. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't risk everything for a business venture that might fail, leaving me homeless and dependent on the goodwill of people who seemed willing to withdraw their love when I didn't give them what they wanted. "I can't," I whispered. "I'm sorry, but I can't." Rebecca nodded slowly, as if she'd expected this answer. "Then get out," she said quietly. "Get out of my house and don't come back." "Rebecca, please," I said, reaching for her one last time. "I said get out," she repeated, her voice rising. "I don't want to see you again until you're ready to put your family first." I looked around the room one last time, taking in the faces of the people I'd loved most in the world. Tommy's eyes were hard with disappointment. Rebecca's face was set in cold determination, and David was still staring at his hands, unwilling to meet my gaze. "I love you," I said, my voice broken with grief. "I love all of you. That hasn't changed." "Love isn't enough," Rebecca said, echoing the words she'd spoken weeks earlier. "Sometimes love means making sacrifices, and you've proven you're not willing to make that sacrifice." I walked to the door on unsteady legs, my heart pounding with the realization that I was losing my family over a decision that felt both right and wrong at the same time. As I reached for the door handle, I turned back one last time, hoping to see some softening in their expressions, some sign that this wasn't really the end. But their faces were closed, hard, the faces of people who had made their decision and wouldn't be swayed by tears or pleas. I left that house knowing that something fundamental had changed in my life, That the easy love I'd taken for granted for decades had been replaced by something conditional and fragile. As I drove home through the December darkness, I wondered if I'd made the right choice, if protecting my home was worth the cost of losing my family. But even as I questioned my decision, I knew I couldn't change it. I couldn't risk everything for a business venture that might fail. Couldn't depend on the goodwill of people who seemed willing to withdraw their love when I didn't give them what they wanted. That night I sat in my empty house, surrounded by the silence of my solitude, and I realized that sometimes the most difficult kind of love is the kind that requires us to say no. Sometimes protecting ourselves isn't selfish. It's necessary. And sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us deepest, not because they don't love us, but because they love themselves more. I had chosen to protect my home, my security, my independence. I had chosen to say no to a request that could have destroyed my financial stability. And in doing so, I had learned that sometimes saying no is the most painful kind of love we can offer. The next morning, I woke to the sound of knocking at my door. I looked out the window and saw David's truck in my driveway, and for a moment, my heart leapt with hope. Maybe he'd come to apologize, to serve as a bridge between me and the family I'd lost. But when I opened the door, I saw that he wasn't alone. Rebecca was sitting in the passenger seat, her face set in the same hard expression she'd worn the night before. And David was holding a suitcase. My suitcase. The one I'd used for vacations with Robert. The one that had been in my closet for years. "Margaret," David said, his voice uncomfortable but determined. "Rebecca packed some of your things." I stared at the suitcase, understanding dawning slowly. "My things?" "Your clothes, your medications, some personal items," he said, not meeting my eyes. "She thought you might need them." "Need them for what?" "For wherever you're going to stay," he said quietly. "Rebecca doesn't want you coming back to get your belongings. She said it would be too difficult for everyone." I took the suitcase with trembling hands, feeling the weight of my exile in its familiar bulk. These were the belongings of my life, reduced to what could fit in a piece of luggage. My books, my photographs, my mementos, all the things that made my house a home, remained behind, held hostage by a family who no longer wanted me. "Tell Rebecca I love her," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I will," David said. But his eyes were sad, as if he knew the message would fall on deaf ears. He drove away, leaving me standing in my driveway with a suitcase full of belongings and a heart full of grief. I was free to enter my own house, but I was no longer welcome in the home of my daughter. I had my security, my independence, my financial stability, and I had never felt more alone in my life. As I carried the suitcase into my house, I realized that I had learned something profound about love and family. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us deepest. Sometimes saying no to the people we care about is the most difficult kind of love we can offer. And sometimes protecting ourselves isn't selfish. It's necessary. I had chosen to say no to a request that could have destroyed my financial security. I had chosen to protect my home rather than risk it for someone else's dreams. And in doing so, I had learned that love isn't always enough, that sometimes it comes with conditions and expectations that we can't meet. But I had also learned that I could survive the loss of my family's approval. I could live with the knowledge that I had made a difficult choice based on practical considerations rather than emotional ones. I could find peace in the understanding that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to enable someone else's poor financial decisions. That night, I unpacked my suitcase in my own bedroom, surrounded by the familiar comfort of my home. I had lost my family, but I had kept my independence. I had disappointed the people I loved most, but I had protected my future. And as I drifted off to sleep, I realized that sometimes the most painful kind of love is the kind that requires us to choose ourselves over others. Sometimes saying no is the most loving thing we can do.